There are stories buried in the dark corners of history, tales whispered in towns that no longer exist, remnants of horrors that refuse to stay forgotten. A search party enters the Oregon wilderness, following the trail of the missing, only to find a nightmare waiting beneath the trees. A mortician with a twisted obsession turns his funeral home into something far worse, his collection growing unseen beneath the surface. These are not legends. These are not myths. These are stories pulled from the shadows of real events. And once you hear them, you'll never unsee what lurks in the dark. In the deep, semi-remote town of Elkhorn, Nevada, nestled between stretches of desolate highways and abandoned mining camps, lay a place where strangers rarely came, and those who did were either lost or looking to disappear. It was March 1996, and spring was beginning to creep in, melting away the frost that had settled over the desert nights. It was here that Jonas Bell arrived on a cool morning, his worn-out truck rattling as he pulled into town. No one asked questions about newcomers in Elkhorn. Folks minded their business, and that suited Jonas just fine. He found work at the local funeral home, Holloway and Sons, a small family-run operation in need of a new assistant. Jonas, with his quiet demeanor and an uncanny knowledge of embalming techniques, fit in seamlessly. The funeral home owner, Richard Holloway, was a weary old man who had inherited the business from his father. He was grateful to have someone as skilled as Jonas, never questioning where he had come from. But there was something unsettling about the man. His stillness, the way he never spoke of a past, and the eerie calm with which he handled the dead. For years, Elkhorn had seen its fair share of tragedies, mining accidents, desert wanderers never making it back, and the occasional drifter who never left town. But it wasn't until a local woman, Sarah Whitmore, passed away that suspicions arose. At her funeral, her daughter Eva Sinclair noticed something was wrong. The body in the casket wasn't her mother. The resemblance was there, but the eyes, the hands, something was off. When she confronted Richard Holloway, he dismissed it as a mistake in the embalming process. Then whispers began. Rumors of missing bodies, of funerals with closed caskets, even when the cause of death wasn't disfiguring. Some locals recalled hearing faint sounds from the funeral home late at night. Muffled voices, footsteps when no one should have been there. It was Ava who started connecting the dots, her curiosity growing into dread. Determined to uncover the truth, Ava followed Jonas after his shift one evening. He left the funeral home, driving down a narrow road leading deep into the desert, far from town. She parked her car at a distance and watched as he pulled up to an old barn, its roof sagging under years of neglect. When he disappeared inside, Ava crept forward. The barn doors were locked, but she found a broken window and climbed through. The air inside was thick with the scent of rot and chemicals. Then she saw it, a trap door in the floor, left slightly ajar. She descended into darkness. The underground chamber was a museum of the dead. Corpses sat at a dinner table, their faces eerily preserved, their bodies stiff with decay. Others were arranged in chairs, posed as if caught mid-conversation. A few were inside glass cases, like grotesque exhibits in a forgotten wax museum. And then came the worst realization. Some of them had been buried alive. The terror set in as Ava saw fingernail scratches on the inside of the glass, mouths twisted in eternal screams. Her stomach churned as she recognized a few of them weren't from Elkhorn. They were drifters, lost souls who had wandered into town and never left. Then, footsteps above, Jonas was coming back. Eva barely made it out of the barn, running through the desert like a hunted animal. She didn't stop until she reached the sheriff's office, breathless and shaking. The authorities raided the property at dawn. What they found shook Elkhorn to its core. Jonas Bell was discovered in the crypt, rocking back and forth, whispering to his family. His eyes were vacant, his lips forming silent words, as if speaking to the lifeless figures around him. When the police tried to pull him away, he resisted violently, screaming that they weren't dead. They were just waiting. The investigation unearthed dozens of missing persons, some preserved for years, others only recently added to his collection. But the most horrifying truth came from the autopsy reports. Jonas hadn't always waited for his victims to die before embalming them. Some had been injected while still alive, their bodies paralyzed, unable to scream as they were prepared for eternity. Jonas Bell never spoke again. He was found mentally unfit to stand trial, committed to an institution where he spent his days staring at the walls, sometimes whispering the names of his victims. Elkhorn tried to move on, but some things can't be buried. The funeral home shut down. The barn was burned to the ground, but locals swore they could still hear voices at night. Whispers carried through the desert winds, calling out names long forgotten. And sometimes, late at night, if you listened closely, you could still hear the faintest scratching sounds beneath the earth. In the isolated Appalachian town of Black Hollow, West Virginia, nestled deep within the mountains, people knew to fear the woods. Legends spoke of Margaret Henshaw, a woman who had lived alone in a secluded cabin for over 40 years. Some claimed she never aged, while others swore they had seen her whispering to the trees, calling forth things unseen. Margaret was a healer, a woman of the earth, one who knew how to cure ailments with roots and herbs. Yet the townfolk didn't call her a healer, they called her a witch. Strange happenings had always surrounded her. Livestock died mysteriously, crops withered without explanation. And then in the spring of 1948, the worst of all happened. A young boy, Daniel Wright, vanished near the forest's edge. His desperate father, Abel Wright, claimed he had seen Margaret watching from the trees just the day before. The whispers turned to outright accusations, and the town of Black Hollow decided to take justice into their own hands. On the evening of April 9th, 1948, a mob formed. Men with torches and hunting rifles stormed into the woods, dragging Margaret from her home. She screamed for mercy, swearing she had nothing to do with the boy's disappearance. "You don't understand," she cried. "There is something else in these woods, something older than all of us." But the men wouldn't listen. They tied her to an old oak tree at the center of town and set fire to the kindling at her feet. As the flames climbed higher, she spoke no curses, no threats. Instead, she only whispered, "You will all burn with me." The fire burned hot and wild, consuming the tree, the ground, and the air around them. The townsfolk swore the sky turned black, darker than any night. Then, just as the fire snuffed out, a strong wind howled through Black Hollow. And in the silence that followed, Daniel Wright walked back into town. Daniel was unharmed, dazed but alive. He claimed he had been wandering the woods, lost in a thick fog. He had seen shadows moving around him, whispering his name, but never once had he seen Margaret Henshaw. The townsfolk stood in stunned silence. They had just burned an innocent woman alive, and that was when the deaths began. One by one, the men responsible for Margaret's murder began to die under horrifying circumstances. Abel Wright, the boy's father, was found hanging from the very tree where Margaret had burned. his eyes wide open in terror, his mouth twisted in an agonized scream. Sheriff Mark Beasley, the man who gave the order to burn her, vanished from his home, only to be found 3 days later, buried alive in Margaret's scorched garden. John Baylor, who had lit the first torch, was found burned to death in his own barn, though there was no trace of fire anywhere else in the building. The town of Black Hollow was gripped in fear. People whispered that Margaret had returned, her spirit stalking the night, her burned face glimpsed in the trees whenever the wind howled. Some fled the town, but many stayed, and the deaths continued. By 1950, most of the men involved in Margaret's murder were dead or missing. Their homes stood abandoned, their names all but erased from town records. Black Hollow itself seemed to rot from the inside, businesses closing, families moving away. Only one man remained, Jacob Wilkes, a teenager at the time of Margaret's burning. He'd been too young to take part, but he had been there, watching from the crowd. One night, after years of silence, Jacob spoke of what he had seen. He told a reporter that as Margaret burned, her eyes never closed. She had stared at each of her executioners one by one, and she had smiled. 2 weeks later, Jacob Wilkes was found dead in his bed, his skin blackened as if burned from the inside out. Black Hollow no longer exists. By the late 1960s, it had become a ghost town. Houses stood empty, shops crumbled, and the forest slowly swallowed the remains. Those who visit the ruins report strange occurrences, unseen whispers, flickering firelight in the trees, and on the windiest nights, the sound of a woman laughing. And those who speak Margaret Henshaw's name, they don't live long enough to regret it. The town of Ashwood, Oregon had always been quiet, a small logging community surrounded by dense forest, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. But in the summer of 1976, people started disappearing. First, a hitchhiker, then a young couple passing through. Then a local woman, Elena Marsh, vanished on her way home from work. Her car was found abandoned on the side of the road. The driver's side door was wide open, the engine still running. But of Elena there was no sign, except for a strange symbol carved into the dirt beside her car. It looked like an eye with 3 vertical slashes beneath it. The local sheriff, David Keller, dismissed the symbol as a meaningless marking. But those who had lived in Ashwood long enough knew better. They had seen the symbol before, burned into trees deep in the woods, long before the town was founded. And those who went looking for its meaning never came back. For years, Ashwood had whispered about the Ashwood Society, an old religious commune that had once lived in the forest outside of town. Founded in the late 1800s, they claimed to worship an entity they called the Hollow One, a being that existed beyond the veil of sight. The group had vanished overnight in 1921, leaving their cabins empty, their belongings untouched. Some believed they had simply moved on. Others said they had never left at all. Sheriff Keller dismissed the connection until more bodies started turning up. The remains of the missing hitchhiker were found near an abandoned fire pit deep in the woods. His body had been positioned upright, his mouth sewn shut with coarse twine. Nearby, another symbol was found, the eye with 3 vertical slashes. Then, the bodies of the missing couple were discovered in an old root cellar beneath an abandoned cabin. They had been starved, their eyes removed, their hands bound in ritualistic poses. The walls of the cellar were covered in writings, repeating the same chilling phrase, "The Hollow One is watching." On September 18th, 1976, A local radio DJ named Todd Evans ran a special on the disappearances. He had received an anonymous tip from someone claiming to have escaped the Ashwood Society. The caller, a woman with a trembling voice, insisted that the cult had never truly disappeared. They had simply gone underground, waiting, watching. They see you when you're alone. They stand in your blind spots. They live in the places no one looks at. The Hollow One chooses who stays and who disappears. Then the line went dead. That was the last broadcast ever aired from Todd Evans' station. The next morning, he was gone. His car was found outside his home, the engine running, the driver's side door wide open. On his kitchen table, a single note was found written in someone else's handwriting. "You should not have looked." By October, the town was in a panic. Sheriff Keller led a search party into the forest, determined to find the cult's hidden base. They followed a trail of strange symbols deeper into the woods, until they found something horrifying. A clearing filled with bodies, the remains of over 24 people, some missing for decades, were arranged in a perfect spiral around a massive wooden effigy. It was shaped like a humanoid figure, its face a gaping hole. Each corpse had their eyes removed, their mouths sealed shut. Then the search party heard whispering. A low, guttural voice echoed through the trees, though there was no wind, no movement. One of the deputies, Henry Walsh, suddenly clawed at his own eyes, screaming about something standing behind him. The others turned to look, but saw nothing. That night, 3 members of the search party went missing. The survivors refused to speak of what they had seen. Sheriff Keller resigned the next morning and left town forever. After the massacre, Ashwood changed. The authorities blamed the deaths on a long-dead cult, and the town tried to move on. But strange things still happen. People disappear. Visitors claim to see tall, dark shapes standing just out of view. Some wake up with deep scratches on their arms, though no one was near them. And those who investigate the Ashwood Society too closely, they always go missing. The last known report was in 2006, when a documentary filmmaker entered the forest to make a film about the cult. He never returned, but his camera did. The footage ends with a single frame, held for 20 minutes. It shows his empty tent, his belongings undisturbed, and a tall, black figure standing just behind the camera, waiting.
It started on a quiet night, with wind that whispered, thin and slight, a tapping sound against my pane, like ghostly fingers in the rain. I rose and looked, my breath held tight, and there he stood beneath the light, so tall, so thin, so pale and dead, a long black coat, black hat on his head. I shut the blinds, I turned the lock, but still I heard that hollow knock. I climbed in bed, pulled covers tight, yet knew he'd wait there through the night. At 1, the hallway groaned with weight. At 2, my door stood open straight. At 3, my breath was not my own. The air grew cold, my limbs like stone. At 4, I dared to take a peek, and found his shadow, dark and sleek. No eyes, no mouth, no breath, no name. Yet still he whispered just the same. At 5, my pulse began to race, for he was there, so close. His face, not flesh, not bone, but empty space, a void where light had no embrace. At 6, the dawn began to creep, but I could feel him, couldn't sleep. And though the sun spilled gold and red, I felt his fingers brush my head. So now I walk, so thin, so tall. I linger quiet in the hall. My coat is black, my face is none. And soon, dear friend, your time will come.